This is a review of the methodology that I teach in both faith, religion, and culture and in medical ethics. So when we're thinking about the forms of reasoning, we can divide this into two different categories. First of all, we need to decide how it is we're going to determine whether an act is good or bad. And there's two ways that we do this. The most common way, the way we think we're doing it most of the time, is through consequentialism. We're looking at the consequences of the act. This is a look before you leap kind of thing, right? If I do this thing, what's going to happen? This is what we often identify with maturity, right? Older children, the older you get, the better you get at being able to see what are the consequences down the road if I do X or Y. And are those consequences something that I want to do or not? This is making lists of pros and cons, right? Very common. This is the standard way that we think about whether I should do something or not. Deontology is the other way. This other thing that's going on here, which we're going to call deontology, it's sometimes referred to different ways. Sometimes people just call it moral reasoning, but it has to do with values. It has to do with notions of what counts as good or bad, not just because of the consequences, but the act itself. Here we're going to focus not on the consequences of the act, but on the act itself, right? So the presumption here is that some acts are intrinsically wrong. A lot of people would say it is wrong everywhere and always to kill human beings. It is wrong everywhere and always to torture innocent children. You can get a lot of agreement on that one. It's the act. You're not looking at the consequences. You're just talking about the act. And the notion here is that this act is everywhere and always wrong, no matter the situation, no matter what the consequences of doing the act. That's not the question. The issue is, can I do this thing? Or am I the kind of person that won't do this thing? Who am I? It's an issue about virtue often, right? So these are the two ways that we think about what counts as a good or bad act. And of course, again, in consequentialism, you've got to have some notion of what counts as a good consequence, which suggests you've got some deontology lurking underneath there somewhere. Whether you can identify it or not, you're presuming that some things are good and some things are not good, that the actual outcomes are good. And that has something to do with deontology. All right, once we've decided whether an act is good or bad, we now have to decide whether we're going to do it. Notice that that's distinct from trying to decide whether the act is good or bad, right? Whether I'm going to do it is a different question. So I may just be a consequentialist, pretty common. I'm going to start with consequentialism. I'm looking at the consequences. It would be a good idea to do X, Y, and Z because we're going to get good consequences. What's the greatest good for the greatest number? Now I'm going to do it. I'm going to not only figure out why this is good, but I'm going to decide I'm going to act according to this kind of reasoning, right? Politically, this is called utilitarianism. How do you get the greatest good for the greatest number? Now, let's look at the possibility of dropping the bomb on Hiroshima. Some people did say, we need to do this because this will end the war sooner. And the sooner we can end the war, the more people will stay alive. And that means the consequences of dropping this bomb are that more people will live. Therefore, we ought to do it. All right. The absolutist says, well, I can see that there might be some good consequences, but this is simply wrong, right? So usually the absolutist is operating from deontological reasons, as they would have done in the question about dropping the bomb on Hiroshima. That is to say, they would say, it's simply wrong. This is torturing innocent children, innocent adults. And therefore, because it's intrinsically wrong, I won't do it, no matter what. Now notice, I not only am using deontology to sort of determine that this act is wrong, but now I'm doing the second thing, which is to make a rule for myself, which is to say, and because it's wrong, I will never do it. I will make no exceptions to my rule here. My rule is based on my deontological assessment of this act. But as an absolutist, I'm not going to make any exceptions. Now, there are some rare occurrences where people are absolutists for consequentialist reasons, as we saw in Quill's article. Remember, he says he has a rule that only if you can only use physician-assisted suicide and never, under any circumstances, use voluntary active euthanasia, right? He has a whole bunch of reasons for this. But the reason he won't make any exceptions, particularly in those cases where you've got patients who meet all his criteria, but who are incapable of actually killing themselves, right? They can't take the medication for one reason or another, quadriplegic, and therefore they ask that someone else does it for them. He's going to say no. I know it's not fair to this person, but I refuse to make any exceptions to the rule. Now, why does he do this? He does it because he wants to get a law passed that allows for physician-assisted suicide. And he knows that people out there are fearful that voluntary active euthanasia might get out of hand. I might wind up in the hospital and get killed when I don't want to get killed. Whether that's a rational fear or not isn't the point. People vote according to their fears a lot of times, right? So he's trying to get people to vote for and allow there to be a legalization of physician-assisted suicide. And he figures that if he makes an absolute line in the sand, I will make no exceptions. This has to be set up with no exceptions possible. Even at the cost, there's going to be a consequence here, the cost of some people not getting to do what would be fair. A few people. On the other hand, the good part here is that we'll pass this law and most people will get a choice on this. And that is, therefore, a consequentialist reason for making sure that he's not going to make any kind of exceptions to his rule. But that's an unusual thing. Most of the time, when people are absolutists, they do it for deontological reasons. Now, I should say one other thing to say about absolutism is that it's often the case that absolutists begin with the presupposition that they didn't set up this circumstance. They find themselves in a difficult situation, and their thought is, look, I'm not responsible for everybody and everything. I'm responsible for the things I do or don't do. And so I didn't set this up. I'm not responsible for the situation. I'm not going to do this act because it's wrong. Boom. They don't consider themselves guilty. They consider themselves to be virtuous. I didn't compromise, right? I did not compromise. Now, the problem is that they're not taking account of whatever the consequences are for their refusing to do whatever they're refusing to do, right? So here comes the moral realist. Here's the third position. This is the person who believes there is such a thing as true moral dilemmas, real situations in which you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You know, it's wrong to do this thing, but they're going to say, I am responsible for both sins of commission, things I do, and sins of omission, things I don't do. Even though I didn't set this up, I'm responsible if I refuse to do things that would make the situation better, right? So they're going to be stuck in a situation where they're going to say, whether am I going to drop the bomb on Hiroshima? Well, no, it's wrong, deontologically wrong. Yeah, but if you don't drop the bomb on Hiroshima, the war is going to keep going. Here's the consequentialist position, and you're going to be responsible for all those additional deaths that happen because the war goes on for a lot longer, all right? So the moral realist starts with a presumption that they're not going to be able to get out of this without being guilty. Whatever they do, they're going to be guilty. Right? Because the act is everywhere and always wrong, no matter what the situation is, no matter what the consequences are. And if they refuse to do it, they're stuck with being guilty for the consequences over here, right? So they accept that they're responsible for both sins of omission, sins of commission, things they do, things they don't do, even if they didn't set up, none of us sets up the full situation in which we're in. But they take seriously the idea that they need to do whatever is least worst in this situation. They're going to have to do something. We're going to do something that's least worst. Now notice that a consequentialist may feel very much the same way, but they're not going to believe that they were guilty. A consequentialist is going to say, look, I did the best I could. It was a bad situation, but I did the best I could. I'm not guilty. I feel bad about it. I regret about the stuff that happened, but I'm not guilty. Do you see the difference? The moral realist says, well, if it's deontologically wrong, it's deontologically wrong. Boom. Everywhere and always. All right?